If you have a late model Volvo S60, V60, or XC90, then you likely have a nightmare waiting for you because you're ignorant doing the rear brakes. Volvos are equipped with an electric parking brake system. This is the motor, and kind of a complicated system here that has a shaft that it can rotate that has this that's behind the piston using a lead screw. And I made the mistake of taking the caliper off with the power still on, and the parking brake extended all the way out because it doesn't have a freaking mechanical stop or something to prevent it from doing so. And when it did, it dumped all the bearings and springs and everything out of itself. So basically, I don't know how to put it back together. I'm either going to have to go buy a new one or sit here and figure it out. So if you have one of these, do not do a rear brake job unless you disconnect the power lead or take the two 6mm Allen screws out of the rear cover. And it's just held on with an O-ring that sits in this groove. And the motor sits on here like this, and just wiggle it off. Then it can't drive the piston out, and then you have to sit there and spin this back mechanically. It does not have an operation to retract itself. So basically it just sits there at an extended position, keeping pressure, and it doesn't really even back off. I'm really shocked that it's so primitive, but also so advanced at the same time. So basically, I'm going to spend the next, I don't know how long, trying to figure out how to put this sucker back together and get the mechanism reinstalled in here. So I have no idea what to expect, but trying to figure out where all these little springs go on the lead screw is probably a nightmare. I may end up having to just go buy a new one. Who knows? But anyway, warning to anyone with a Volvo with electronic parking brake in the rear. Do not take the car, turn it on when you have the caliper off, because the parking brake must have a sensor. It just started extending and extending and extending until it got all the way across. There was still one pad in this side, and that stopped it. But the piston was completely loose and out of its cradle by that point. So, yeah. Anyway, nightmare. So after like an hour and a half of fiddling with this thing and eating a pizza and watching the new Scream movie, which sucks, by the way, I finally figured out how to put this thing together, and I'm going to post a couple of pictures as well. So if this ever happens to anyone else, you can actually repair it. So basically what it boils down to is when it came apart, it unscrewed itself to the point where this piston went all the way to the top, pushing the actual piston across the caliper and out, because I was a moron and left the power connected. But anyway, to put this thing together, there are two long springs. One's really long and one's kind of long. And I don't really know which one goes on either end, but I suspect it probably won't matter. But there are about 7 or 8 little springs that are really short that you see in the pictures. And basically the way these work, and I found pictures of lead screws on the internet, or ball screws. You put the stop screw in the bottom side, and then you start feeding in, the big spring. One of the springs has to go on the bottom end. And then you start feeding in several balls, and you just work them around and down. And after 4 or 5, then you put one of the little small springs in, and it spirals around down in there too. And oops, looks like I've got one extra. I'll have to take the long spring out again and work that in. But there's I guess I have 8 of them in there instead of 9. That sucks. I'm going to have to take them back out. But basically, it's every so often you have a a couple of screw balls, and then you have a little spring, and then a couple of balls and a spring. And then you have these long springs that sit on the ends, and they sit into grooves, and they keep the balls compressed between the two pairs of them. So there's one back here that's in there, very similar to the way that one's compressed. And that's all there is to it. And I'm going to have to disassemble it to put that one in. And I'll have to take out a couple of balls and stick it in between them just to make sure it keeps enough tension. But basically, you can see, I don't know if I can put this down and do it now. Let's see if I can figure out how to do this with one hand. But you can see the lead screw operates very smoothly. And I should be able to wind this up to the other end and then show you the spring in the back side. So you can see the long screw threaded around there that is also sitting in the groove for the stop. So there's one on both ends like that. And all the little screws and the springs are in between and kind of evenly spaced out. It's like 4 or 5 balls, then a spring, 4 or 5 more balls, then a spring, like that all the way through. So I'll likely remove this one. It's easier to take out from that little groove. Pull the spring out. Just all you got to do is work the little end up and then just kind of pull it out. And then I'll take a couple of screw balls out, and then I'll stick that spring in, put the other 2 or 3 balls in, and then wedge the spring back in. That's all there is to it. And then I'll lube it all back up, put it back together. So yeah, you can save your deal. Oh, and one little trick to this little compression ring that's sitting on the backside, it's not a C-clamp, and it doesn't sit in a groove. It just kind of compression fits to hold the assembly together. And this nut on the back sits on a, like on a, I don't know, like almost like a nut flange. And you have to make sure that when you put this back together that when it screws down all the way, like this, that it ends up running across and into the stop. So I just hit the stop. So if you have to time it right, but it's actually not too hard. You can back that little spring thing off, and and then you can pull the nut plate, this back stop plate, back down the shaft. You can see kind of the grooves up and down the shaft that I created playing with it. But you can pull it off, and then you can rotate it a little bit to put it back on one of the other little nut faces that make it sink to the plate. But it's really not hard to put back together. So anyway, hopefully this helps somebody someday. Yeah, instead of spending $200 or $300 on another brake caliper arrangement, they do not sell this separately. So this thing, when it's finally put together, I'll go ahead and walk over here and show you something. Okay, so here's the actual piston. And this sits inside of the piston. It only goes in 2 ways, like that. And sits in there like that. And you'll notice that that amount of extra lead screw has a spot down in the bottom that it goes in. And then this whole assembly is your piston and slides back and out of this shaft. And when it's out of here, there's an O-ring inside of there, and then I'll put this O-ring back on the back. And I'll make another video as I put it back together kind of explaining it. And yeah, you can rebuild this. It's not so bad. I thought it was going to be a nightmare, and I was not looking forward to it. But once I figured it out, it's actually pretty easy. Okay, so I've backed it out, I pulled the spring out, and I have 3 balls in my hand for that one little extra screw, and now I'm going to show you how you put it back together. I don't know how I'm going to hold the camera, I'll figure that out, hang on. Okay, so I found a position for the camera. You can see the lead screw and the balls down underneath there, and I can rotate them, but there's a few in my hand as well. So I'm going to take that one little spring And we're going to hold this in a position where you can see it. And I'm going to drop it into that groove right there. And then I'll come back with the camera and let you see what I've done. So I'm using kind of a little knife to lay it down flat. And now that it's in there flat, you can see it. And I'm going to just simply slide it using like a tiny screwdriver. It's kind of hard. I'm using a knife actually to push it into one of the grooves. And now it's actually embedded. You can see that I've shoved it around very slightly. And now I'm going to drop the remaining 3 ball bearings down in that groove as well. And I'll come back so you can see those. I've dropped them all and I'm going to work them into that groove as well. And that just takes a little bit of effort with the knife. And now that I've worked those 3 in there, I'm going to come back and show you. They are now past the point. And now I'm just simply going to take, and it's a little bit of work, the spring and work it down in there as well. And all of these little springs will compress some, but it will not completely go in unless you kind of work the lead screw down. So it takes a little bit of effort to basically push them, and I kind of turn it and push. Now that I've created some space for my spring, I can actually get started here. Just take the spring and work it down into the groove, and it just starts sliding in. And it takes a little bit of effort, and you'll have to kind of rotate to make yourself some room. And then I ended up taking the back end of this knife and just kind of pulling the spring down in there until it's flat and it falls into that groove, and at that point I'm done. So now it's locked into place. There's a similar spring on both ends, and you should see, there it goes. I've now completed the assembly, and I'm going to put the whole brake back together. Okay, so I've got the camera here. Again, I'm going to prop it up this time. And I know this is not fabulous camera work, but you know, beggars can't be choosers here. So let's try to get this in a position I can use it. Okay, so you should be able to see me working now from it's really not an ideal camera position, but should be good enough for what I'm doing. Okay, so this is the caliper. I've cleaned it up a lot. You can see the back end. And then here is the e-brake assembly. Pretty shocking how simple it is, but also how complicated. So I'm going to grab some oil real quick, just to lube it up just a little bit before I put it back together. So bear with me 1 second here. Okay, so I've gotten a little bit of brake fluid to use as lubricant to put the sucker back together. First thing I'm going to do is run a little bit of oil or brake fluid around the O-ring that goes on the back edge to lubricate this thing, and put a little bit more on the lip, and I'm going to work the O-ring back onto the groove very carefully, making sure I don't mess it up. So that's the first step. I put that sucker back on. Next, I'm going to take a little bit more oil on my finger, and I'm going to lubricate the back end of the shaft here. And I'm also going to grab the thrust bearing that slides onto this. And very important that you make sure that thrust bearing goes back on there, and I'm going to add some lubrication to it as well. Doesn't take much because it will be submerged in brake fluid on its own eventually. Okay, so now that I've done that, I'm going to slide the e-brake, it only goes in kind of one way into the piston. And now that the piston has been inserted, I'm just going to wipe a film around the outside of it. And now I have the whole assembly, and I'm going to also rub a little bit on the inside of here. So it's a little hard to see, but the O-ring down inside of there and the lip on the piston sleeve, I want both of those to be lubricated before I try to slide this sucker back in there. So we'll have to work it back in once we get it all assembled. But basically, at this point, I've got to work the piston back inside of the sleeve. And it's a little harder than it looks to do, but let's see if we pull it out, if that'll make our lives easier. See, it slid out and the thrust bearing fell out. I'm going to have to stand this up on edge. I think that's the smarter way to do this. So we're just going to go back into that groove. This is too hard. I'm just going to pause the camera and work it in there. You know what I'm doing. Okay, so I just finished putting it back together. That was a pain in the ass. So the hardest thing actually was getting the rubber sleeve back on. It really does not want to go in there. You can't just push it in because it'll compress behind the piston and block you from inserting it. So yeah, you can repair them.